Morning Revolution, and welcome to all of our friends on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. Happy to have you, Joel and Taryn. Good morning, and Scott, Rosanna, and Anita are off this week. They're on their way to Houston, where the International Department is sponsoring a conference on imperialism today. If you want to check it out, go to cpusa.org and look for the link. It's starting tomorrow, Saturday at, I believe, 12 Central, 1 Eastern, and 9 Pacific. Lots been in the news this week, including a report, Joel, that the Oathkeepers have several hundred recruits in the military, in the police departments, fire departments, and other places of prominence throughout the country. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised. I mean, if we think historically about semi-fascist, let's call it, organizations like Oathkeepers, historically in the United States, they've been closely tied to the police, to current and former military, to other similar other types of sources of recruits. And you know, I think that we have to think about them not just as a like a violent militia that sort of reactionary against the government or whatever, but to think of them as employer associations, right? It's essentially a mechanism for parts of the capitalist class to create conditions in which they can reassert their dominance of labor management, control of the workforce, control of the political landscape, to get their way in a particular situation.
So this is like an organization of strike breakers, like back in the day. What was the name of that outfit that was used to break strikes, broke the steel strike? Anybody remember? Taryn, you remember the name of that outfit?
No, I can
There were
think
the
of two other
Pinkertons.
examples. The Klan.
The Klan is
The
one. What did
American
you say,
Legion
Scott?
was used in that way,
Which
played
one?
that role. So the American Legion played that role, but the agency that was hired was the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Pinkertons after the Pinkos. That was the one, and they were used on the railroads. They were used to break the steel strike, big time. And Joe, you make a very important point that that's the one of the ways that the ruling class uh, employs to manage not just labor but the people generally, working class people, black folk, Latinos, so forth. So Scott, what do you do about it? I mean, and by the way, let's be real. It's not just the Oath Keepers. It's also the Klan and the neo Nazis and the what do they call them? Those proud little midgets that are running around. They call them boys, but they're really ideological and political midgets. Um, and several hundred, Scott, is a very low count, I would guess.
Yeah, several hundred confirmed, documented of one particular organization is a very, very tiny tip of an enormous iceberg. And there have been reports on this, including reports um, from the FBI for some time that white supremacist terrorist organizations um, have infiltrated and are working with and in police departments in particular. What's necessary is that the people be in a position to reassert its control um, over the police. The demand is for community control of police in a lot of places, and that's really, I think, what's necessary. If people are being empowered to carry guns around on the streets, then the people who are at risk from that should be the ones making decisions about hiring and firing and training, and because it's not just the presence of some ideologically reactionary. It's also the development of an extremely violent and reactionary training culture within police departments. The whole idea of police officers as warriors, and the disparity between the amount of time they spend learning about de-escalation versus the amount of time they spend learning, doing arms training. It all needs to change, and community control is the answer.
By the way, we have a brand new pamphlet out. I don't have it here. I've left it in my bag. Community control of the police. Out. Order your copies. Go to cpusa.org and order your copies. Or write cpusa at cpusa.org and get your pamphlet. Here we go. Community, look. Here's the front. Can you see that? Community control of the police. Joel was one of those who helped write it, along with Eric and Jamal Rich. Community control of the Tim Johnson. All of us contributed to drafting it. Taryn, what do you do about it? I mean, first of all, to me, the idea that the FBI is looking into the penetration of the military and police and intelligence is a little bit like, actually, it's a lot of like the hens, the foxes guarding the hen house. I mean, don't we need extra official overview of the entire policing and military apparatus in the country?
Yeah, I think that one of the most dangerous things about groups like the Oathkeepers is just like the Klan, where it's like, of course, the people who show up in hoods with torches and do violence are dangerous, but it's also all of the people who are in official positions, like in the judiciary, in the police, in local elected officials, who will look the other way on that kind of right-wing vigilante violence. And so I think that right now, especially with what's going on with the January 6th hearings and what's happening with, I know that Trump has like a friendly judge in Florida, it's time to sort of re-examine how these right-wingers got into power. And then, yeah, I agree, we need some sort of oversight that's outside of the FBI that can come in and really clean house. I mean, it just goes to show you how rotten some of these institutions are, that these people have been allowed to join without any problem until now. And I think that now that the state is taking it seriously because they see that there is a threat to their legitimacy and that it's coming from these right-wing corners, to discover suddenly that the house is full of rot, you need to call in some worker to come in and take all of that out for you. So I think it's very dangerous. It's not surprising at all. But I don't think that we're going to be able to get very far in official channels combating the ultra-right or the extreme right without addressing the fact that they've taken the time and they've taken decades to be able to infiltrate the government at all different levels to prevent the people from actually making any progress on that front. So,
well, in many respects, they are the government. And in some respects, they didn't penetrate. They organized it in the first place. And by the way, let's remember that the policing in this country, Joel, had its origin in the slave catchers back in the day, when they had the Fugitive Slave Act and that kind of thing. And then after slavery, they were replaced by the Klan and other elements. And so there's a straight line between what happened during the slave period through today. And therefore, there has to be a fundamental reorganization of the agencies of the state. In fact, the state itself has to be reorganized, dismantled, recreated in a new political dispensation. And Joe, you raised the point last time you were on about the need for, what'd you call it, a constitutional assembly, constitutional convention to when hopefully one day when a new society is organized that will put together a new political framework for the country. And they had something like that in Chile. A new center-left government was elected about a year ago. That was preceded by a call for a constitutional convention, and the new president kept the promise. But boy, did they get their butts whooped. I mean, it was like 60% to 38% or something like that. But it was quite a progressive constitution. Uh, Much of what we can draw some lessons from. No.
Well,
Yeah, I think that the what we're going to discover in the next few weeks probably is the extent to which U.S. government institutions like U.S. aid and National Endowment for Democracy played a role in spreading misinformation about that democratic constitution to sort of overturn the progress and the momentum of the democratic forces in Chile. But I also think that, you know, the U.S. government has been campaigning against that for the last 2 years, right? Ever since it became clear that 80%, the vast majority of Chilean society wanted a new constitutional process, they began to campaign against that. And like 4 days ago, you saw the Washington Post publish an op-ed about this constitution. The first sentence references Chile's sitting on vast stores of lithium, which are, of course, U.S. capitalists want access to. And the concern in this op-ed, this op-ed in the Washington Post was that too much democracy in Chile would be undemocratic, right? That was the logic of their argument. And you know, if you look at the U.S. aid Agency for International Development, they just recently published a handbook on democratic decentralization, right? Which is essentially a program for extending neoliberalism and disallowing other countries to, you know, create principles of like national control over their resources, right? They don't want to have any roadblocks to the access U.S. imperialism has to natural resources, and they clearly saw this constitution as a mechanism for enhancing Chilean self-determination, and so they were against that from the beginning. And I think we're going to discover that they played a big role in a misinformation campaign that helped confuse a lot of people about this particular constitutional process.
I'm sure they did. Lithium, isn't that what they're using? Cell phones and batteries and all that kind of thing. Taryn,
electric car batteries.
50%, according to this Constitution, of women would have been had to make up office holders for state agencies and institutions. Chile would have been a multicultural and intercultural state where indigenous peoples would have autonomy. The Constitution would have recognized free exercise of sexual and reproductive rights. It would have guaranteed ecological sustainability and water rights. It would have changed the structure of the state. Very important. In fact, one person said it would have been the most progressive constitution in the world. I don't know if that's true. The Soviet Constitution was pretty progressive, but it would have been a advanced democratic dispensation, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that, you know, I don't know exactly what the issues were that seemed to stop people from coming to the polls and voting to ratify the Constitution. But I think, like Joel said, there were some really interesting falsehoods floating around out there. I think one of the strongest was that the new Constitution would somehow ban home ownership, which I imagine would have probably startled some people if they heard that kind of rumor going around. I know that the strongest pushback against the new Constitution was actually emanating from those parts where indigenous cultures and nations were actually very strong and have been locked in a battle with various mining and lumber interests to take control of their areas. And so I assume that that's also part of what was financing this disinformation campaign. But I hope that moving forward, that they can sort of revamp a bit the constituent assembly process, how it was that they came up with the Constitution, and come back with something that's new. I hope this isn't the end, and I don't think it is the end for Chilean democracy. I do know that there's been such tremendous advances for the left in Latin America. And when there are those kinds of tremendous advances, you're going to see sort of a reaction to that from the ultra-right. I know that Trump, for instance, just came out and endorsed Jair Bolsonaro today, called him the tropical Trump, for instance. And so, the right, again, is organizing internationally, and they're fighting back against progress wherever they find it. So,
The tropical Trump. Poor Brazil. Oh my. But Lula's going to win. I predict today that Bolsonaro's going to get his butt whooped, and that Lula and the people and the working class, and by the way, the Communist Party of Brazil playing a big role in that campaign, and they're going to take it all the way to the victory line. Scott, this is the first anniversary of Striketober. Last year, there was a big strike wave. And don't you know, Scott, that according to the Gallup poll, which is a kind of conservative polling outfit, 71% of the American people support unionization, support unions, which is the highest number since the 50s. Big thing. And I was reading a piece this morning in Albany, over 30% of the population of workers, not the population, but the people who are working are in unions, which compares to 10.2% around the country. So go Albany, go Albany. I'm gonna say it one more time, go Albany. So that's a big development, Scott, and I don't know if it's happening. And are there any Starbucks organized in your neck of the woods, Scott?
No, there are barely any Starbucks. I think there's one at a Target about 40 minutes away. But
Where do y'all
no,
drink
there's
coffee?
not from Starbucks anyway. But there is, even the ripples and the echoes and the effects of this are felt far beyond where where you're seeing picket lines, even around here, which is a deeply conservative rural area. Conversations you have with people, it's more and more obvious that there's an understanding that the basic conflict of society is between a billionaire corporate elite and working people. That said, there's also a lot of people working to deform and distort that class consciousness that's developing. If you think about what the right wing is doing, especially Tucker Carlson and others around him, they're trying to position themselves as the party of the working class, the part by which they mean mostly white, mostly rural, mostly blue collar, a very restrictive definition. So there's I think, an ideological struggle that has to be waged in conjunction with this to make sure that this class consciousness that's develops in its full kind of measure in our understanding of what the working class is: multiracial, multinational, men, women, based on equality. But it is like big changes are in the air.
Actually, Joe, the Republican Party, which is becoming, I'm not sure they're there yet, but it's morphing into a fascist-like party in many respects. In fact, I heard one Republican commentator say it's a neo-fascist party. She's part of the what do you call the fake Republicans? They got a name for them. I forget what it is. But they have an all people's front approach to their political strategy as well. And it ranges from big business and the big banks to sections, upper echelons of the working class. Just like we have a concept of a people's front that extends from what Scott described as the multiracial, multi-gendered, intergenerational working class, up to those sections of capital, big business that oppose the Republican right. And by the way, there's some very interesting. I'm so fascinated by William Barr, who is now going after Trump like nobody's business, which I imagine is not his individual decision, but he's speaking as a representative of a faction of the ruling class that was with Trump up until the last minute. I mean, to the last second. And then when he started going bat loco, they broke with him. And so the question now becomes, how do we mobilize this broad popular front and guarantee working class leadership of it, Scott, so that in the midterm elections, there can be a Democratic, big D, I ain't afraid to say it, there has to be a big D Democratic victory in the midterms, which will develop into small d democracy. Because one of the big problems with the unionization rates in this country is the laws governing union rights. That's why the PRO Act has to be passed. And we're not going to be able to pass that until the Democrats have a majority in the Senate and in the House. And even then, it's not going to be easy because big business is going to be lobbying like nobody's business. Am I right or wrong?
Well, you're right, of course, but it's interesting to note that Joe Manchin, who made himself one of the principal roadblocks to the advancement of the rights and well-being of working people, is a co-sponsor of the PRO Act. So even with him as a co-sponsor, the supposed kingmaker, whatever, the decider of the Senate, it still couldn't happen. So it's going to be a very very uphill battle, but it is necessary because the organized labor is it's not just about the rights of unionized workers. It's a force that enhances conditions and fights for the dignity of all working people. So the PRO Act would be huge.
I read this morning in the Morning Star that there's a big strike wave taking place in the UK. They got a new prime minister. Her name is Liz Truss. I don't think you can trust her, pardon that play on words, because she started off early in life as a left winger, and now she's on the far right, following the trajectory of folks like Benito Mussolini. Anyway, the story in the Morning Star, which by the way is our sister publication in the UK, wonderful history. They claim to be the only daily working class socialist daily in the country, which really isn't true because there's also People's World. They are the only daily working class socialist public in print. So, comrades, you got to put a little parentheses on your masthead saying in print, because otherwise,
and in English.
Right, we're going to argue with you about that issue. But they made the point. I'm going all around the barn to get to the point. They made the point, Taryn, that the death of the Queen, I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but you kind of have to, uh, will there'll be an attempt to impose national unity and say, no, you can't strike, no, you can't protest, no, you can't upset the boat because the country is in mourning at this particular moment in time. And they said, we're not going for it. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, when I was on my way here this morning, I was looking at my Twitter timeline, and it seems as though the government in the United Kingdom has stopped hearing petitions officially out of a sense of mourning for the Queen. And so that's just right there, proof positive that that's correct, that there is an attempt to sort of impose this kind of national unity on the country. I mean, look, the Queen left the country in a total mess. You've got Brexit, you've got these incredibly skyrocketing energy prices right now, which are going to result in death, I think, in the United Kingdom when it gets colder this year. You've got just the skyrocketing prices across the board. You've got a serious crisis of legitimacy when it comes to the British state. It's a different world now. And they're going, this is how dangerous I think racism and national chauvinism is, because Brexit has really put the British people in this situation where they are stuck with their own ruling class at this point, and they're going to have to contend with them. And I think that, the British workers are extremely militant. They've had a really proud history of struggle, and I'm not surprised at all at the strike wave coming down the pipe, because they do need a change. I just wonder really what's going to happen next, because it's a little bit disturbing, really, frankly, just considering how the state looks like it's kind of threatening to crumble apart at this point in the UK. I think that the Queen dying at this point is definitely going to send a lot of people into a panic because they've got a lot to account for now.
Calls for national unity are always a slippery slope. Sometimes you got to do it. When you're fighting fascism, part of that People's Front is a temporary alliance with sections of capital. Well, it's a slippery slope. In the period of the Second World War, Earl Browder got confused by the call for and demand for national unity in the fight against Hitler and Mussolini and Japanese militarism. And he decided that we don't need a militant working class party. Party was dissolved. And then the Cold War came. And we ended up in jail, serving time for thinking Marxist thoughts. That's what happened. So you always got to be careful and not lose your class perspective. And that's what the Morning Star was talking about. Now, let's move to our last, but not the least significant point, our mailbag. We got a question from our listening audience. The person, I want to join the party, I'm interested, but my main concern, a lot of this Marxism, Leninism I've seen on the internet, online, is the America is bad, and they'll side with anybody who's against America. And they want to support what they call existing socialism in China or DPRK, neither of which, in my opinion, is socialist or communist. They also support Putin. What's up with that? I guess my biggest concern is, what is your stance on authoritarianism? Where do you stand? Scott?
So there's a lot going on in that question.
By the way.
But I think, I would start with the question of authoritarianism, which is something that that communist parties are often tasked with. And to understand that, we have to think about two different kinds of democracy: the democracy of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, and the democracy of the working class. Capitalist democracy is based on the basis of power is an individual and their resources. Capitalists are people who have the resources to exercise power individually. So capitalist democracy is about preventing, like, coming together as a collective, but making sure that collective doesn't interfere too much with an individual's right to exercise power. Working class democracy is the opposite, right? Working class people don't exercise power individually. We can't do that. We exercise power as a collective. So working class democracy is about finding a way to include individuals, make sure they can contribute and participate, but to prevent individuals from derailing the exercise of power by the collective. Think about a union on strike, right? You don't get to, one person doesn't get to decide to break the strike just because they disagree with it. So there's a fundamental difference there. And of course, to a member of the capitalist class, working class power, working class democracy is going to feel repressive and authoritarian, because that's the point, right? To take power away from the capitalists and put it in the hands of working people. That said, we do strive to develop. Socialism is the highest form of democracy, and we always have to keep working to make sure that we're as democratic as we can be, but without ever falling into the trap of thinking that our democracy should look like capitalist democracy.
Is Marxism anti-American, Taryn?
No, I don't think that Marxism is anti-American by any stretch of the word, unless you're talking about American chauvinism or you're talking about U.S. nationalism. Obviously, we're internationalists, but I think that Marxism is absolutely the best thing for people in this country. That's why I've tried to do my best to work towards it. I guess to the person asking the question, though, and see what Marxist Leninists actually think, because I don't think that we, the Communist Party, would necessarily associate ourselves with every person online who are talking like they are Marxist Leninists. So I would just advise a little bit of caution for what you read online. Feel free to reach out to the party, submit an application, talk to an organizer. They can answer these questions a lot better than just sort of like doom scrolling through social media or making assumptions or even listening to the show. I mean, someone can actually sit down with you and answer these questions in depth in a way that, will be much more satisfying to you than just sort of arguing online.
Doom scrolling on social. That's a new one. I ain't heard that one before. I'm going to have to write that bad boy down. Joe, why are all these internet Marxists supporting Putin? What's up with that? Is that a Marxist?
Well, we often frame, going back to the war in Iraq, we frame a critique of U.S. foreign policy as you either for it or you're against it, right? And if you're against it, then you must be for this terrible, terrible, terrible thing that's happening someplace else. And it's simply not the case. I don't think that our position is to support Putin as much as it is to end U.S. imperialism, which has exerted control over NATO in nefarious ways. U.S. imperialism backed a coup in Ukraine. Instead of sitting down with Russia and developing a plan for collective security and mutual economic benefit, they provoked hostilities. They escalated armed violence in eastern Ukraine, and then they put Europe in this sort of no-win situation of supporting Ukraine at the expense of their sort of economic security, and now they're going to suffer through the winter, as was mentioned earlier in the show. So to say that I oppose U.S. imperialism is not to say that I support any other government's actions. I think that, that's sort of a narrow, sort of non-Marxist approach to understanding the complexities of foreign policy. I think a good Marxist opposes U.S. imperialism and U.S. Nationalism and xenophobia, and and doesn't fall into the trap of thinking in either or terms.
You know, I had a grandma. My grandmother was so mad at what Paul Robeson called big white folks that anything that anywhere in the world that opposed U.S. imperialism, she was for. I mean, it could have been Gaddafi in Libya. It could have been anyone anywhere else around the world. She supported, as long as they were standing up to big white folks. She but and I understand that point of view. But we also understand that our friends and comrades around the world make a big distinction between U.S. imperialism and the policies of the American government and the American people and the American class. We stand with the working class and the American people and the working class of people around the world, for that matter, which is why we call ourselves working class internationalists. And so we invite our friend, join the Communist Party, because we're a party that stands with the working class and people of our country against imperialism, and we are in solidarity with people around the world who are struggling, including those in the Ukraine, those in Russia, those in Southern Africa, the continent as a whole, Latin America, Brazil, Chile. We wish them success in their organization of a new constitution. And we know that they wish us success in the effort to defeat Trump and big business and those fascist elements, and they are fascist, in the next election. Well, that does it for us this week. Before I end, I want to remind you to get our wonderful pamphlet on community control of the police. We got to do one on community control of the military, too. CPUSA at cpusa.org. Order it today, hot off the press. And I want to give a shout out before I end to the nurses in Minneapolis. 30,000 of them are about to go on strike on Monday. So we wish you every success. Power to the nurses, power to the people, power to the working class. Stay strong, stay safe, stay in the fight, and we'll see you next week. Joel, Scott, Taryn, thank you. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, comrades.